Kia ora, and welcome to Shared Lunch, brought to you by Sharesies in association with BusinessDesk. Sharesies is a wealth development platform whose purpose is to create financial empowerment for everyone. My name is Dan Brunskill. I'm the markets reporter at BusinessDesk, and we have a special offer for Sharesies investors. If you want to use the promo code SharedLunch100, you'll get $100 off an annual subscription to BusinessDesk, which is usually $249, including GST. The offer only applies to new BusinessDesk subscribers and can only be used once per subscriber, and it cannot be used with any other discounts. All right, before we jump into the podcast, here's some important information from Sharesies.
Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording.
Also, as a reminder, if you have questions for our guests today, and I hope you do, you can submit them through the Ask a Question button, which you'll find down below the screen. Don't put your questions in the discussion area, as they're likely to get missed there. But do ask questions. Really keen to hear your thoughts on what you want to know. Be kind and respectful towards our guest and your fellow viewers. Otherwise, we will take steps to remove you from the webinar. Today, we're joined by Benji Patterson. He's an independent economist and strategist, mainly working with clients in the regions, helping them understand economic data, trends, and has worked with just about every local authority and economic development agency in New Zealand. So welcome, Benji.
Kia ora. Good to be here, Dan.
Great to have you online and acting as our tour guide around the tourism economy.
I'll do my best.
You're based in Arrowtown, is that right?
Yeah. So based out of the beautiful village of Arrowtown, we did actually win New Zealand's most beautiful small town. So no, it's a fantastic spot, and it's just great actually to be able to see visitors returning to our shores. It's been quite cool to, I guess, it's not hearing the accents so much because, there's a whole multitude of accents in this part of the world, but it's, seeing those people wandering the streets and the bag tags all really, again on their backpacks, and that it's sort of something that we've missed the last few years. So no, it's good to have people back.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what is it like living in such a tourist destination? But for the past few years, it was probably quite quiet.
Yeah, it was, which, look, on one hand, that was cool. We were able to rediscover our own backyard, our local backyard, that sometimes when there are a lot of visitors, we're crowded out of a little bit. There's long queues, It's expensive. So locals really got out and supported Queenstown businesses as much as they could. But that wasn't enough. It was really hard. There's only so few people that live here, and there's a lot of product on offer, and we need to share that with not just New Zealand, but the world.
Yeah. So try and catch us up on at a very high level, what's happening with tourism. Obviously, for a couple of years there, it was shut down almost completely, and it was sort of huge news when Australians could come over. Kind of where are we at now? We kind of had that complete shutdown, and now it's coming back.
Yeah, look, in the Southern Lakes, Queenstown area, we're kind of in a bit of a parallel, universe at present. We've got the Australian school holidays. We've just had them, and they overlapped with the New Zealand school holidays. So town has been absolutely pumping. We don't quite yet know where we're at relative to pre-COVID, but most things that I've seen and people I've talked to, it seems like we're in about 80 to 90% of pre-COVID levels. The reality is, though, this is a bit of a winter bubble that we're in. Okay. Aussies, they're coming in their droves to ski. They haven't been able to ski for years, chomping at the bit to hit the slopes. So they're over here in their masses, and we're only just coping to be able to service this demand. We've only just got enough staff to turn on the lights each day, and people are getting tired. So it's a real sprint these few weeks, and people are going to need a bit of a break after the holidays.
Because presumably after the shutdown, lots of those businesses either closed or let go of staff. Sort of how much of that tourism infrastructure is still sitting there ready to be used?
Luckily, many of the businesses survived. They downsized. Some went into hibernation, some just massively downsized. So Queenstown's tourism sector lost thousands of jobs. And not all those people didn't actually become unemployed. Some of the people went back home. that were overseas, temporary migrants, while others found work in other industries, such as in construction and the agricultural sector, or they moved elsewhere in New Zealand. So the sector downsized massively, and that's why we're facing challenges in that this demand has come back ferociously fast, and it takes time to rebuild that capacity.
So, labor shortages are something that's happening in all corners of the economy right now. But it sounds like it's particularly bad in Queenstown, and part of the reason is that so many staff have left to go and work in other industries.
Yeah, exactly. So job ads in the hospitality space in Queenstown are at record levels. And they've been at record levels for a while. Even when we had half the usual demand, job ads were at record levels. So you think of labour shortages you're seeing around New Zealand, and then times that by 10. And that's the situation on the ground in Queenstown. And businesses, they're having to get creative in their solutions for this. Some of it, unfortunately, means they're actually reducing their hours. So I'm in the local business association here in Arrowtown, and there have been times where there's had to be a ring around to see who's actually going to be open on a certain night to make sure that there's going to be an establishment open, to feed visitors, and that's a real thing. Businesses are not able to be open the hours that they'd like to be.
Wow! So even having to tag team saying you'll open Tuesday night and I'll open Wednesday night.
Yeah, that was having to happen. Thankfully, with this holiday period, businesses are really pulling out all stops to make sure that they're open. It's just they're having to work their staff very, very hard. So staff are getting tired. There's only, so many days in a row that you can operate at 120%. And that's what I was saying earlier. People are going to need a break. So we really got to look out for the mental health and well-being actually of people that are working in the visitor sector. Ironically, it's not because they don't have a job or they're worried about having that job. It's because they're just being worked very, very hard at present.
And how do you see this settling down? You sort of said we are in a bit of a bubble where we have both Australia and New Zealand school holidays, and everyone wants to ski after not being able to for 2 years. Is this just going to be a 4-week period in which things are crazy, and then it dies down to a low level again, or kind of how do you see this shaking out?
Yeah, look, things are undoubtedly going to quieten down again after these school holidays. They're not going to go down to a low level, I don't believe, because we'll have that next wave of Australian visitor that comes in. Currently, we've had the families. We'll have the dinks, the double income, no kids will come in next, come for their ski week, and that'll. So, but it'll be actually in some ways, it'll be helpful if we can just take a little bit of a breather, still have good enough demand, because coming off such a low base, anything's going to be good enough. And it'll allow businesses to really work on rebuilding their workforce and thinking about how they can get themselves ready for the summer season, because that's the big thing. The summer season, when people return, from long haul markets over that time period, when they're about New Zealand for long periods of time. It's not just a ski week. People come over for a couple of weeks and want to tour around. We've really got to use this time wisely to make sure that we've actually got the capacity not only to deliver a product to people, but to deliver a quality product that has people going home and saying, hey, it was worth the wait. New Zealand was awesome.
Yep. And let's talk about that long haul travel, because that seems to be ramping back up as well. You're hearing lots of stories, particularly overseas, but you see it here as well about airports being overwhelmed and airlines having to bring on more planes that they had put out to pasture as that demand kind of ramps up. Are we seeing, talking about a lot of Australian tourists coming in, are we seeing a lot of longer haul tourists coming in, or are we expecting that to start happening?
Look, as of today, we're not seeing so many long haul tourists. Of course, people are coming. I think a lot of them are actually visiting friends and family, people coming over from England or the US to meet the grandkids, that kind of thing. During the summer, we will undoubtedly begin to get a lot of long haul tourists returning. If we look, for example, at Auckland Airport, they're saying just over 70% of capacity will have come back by the summer. If we look at organisations such as the Tourism Export Council, they're saying maybe around 60% of visitors will have returned. if we think about the footprints of individual airlines, you look at the focus Air New Zealand's put on re-establishing their network into North America. So quite clearly, there are signals that demand will be coming this summer from some of those long haul markets.
Traditionally, quite a bit of our tourism has been made up of Chinese tourists and sort of tour groups from China. With them still pursuing sort of a zero COVID policy, that seems unlikely. Are we expecting to see Chinese tourists anytime soon?
Not anytime soon. And so, it's very unlikely that there'll be any material numbers of Chinese tourists over this coming summer season and into autumn next year. That being said, the Chinese New Year is actually an important part of the visitor calendar in New Zealand. And we've got to remember that there are many Chinese in other parts of the world that may look to come to New Zealand during that holiday period. A large Chinese population in Australia and in other parts of Southeast Asia that we do have strong air connections with. So it's not only mainland Chinese, but also Chinese from elsewhere potentially.
So it sounds a little like we're expecting tourism volumes to recover, perhaps to 70% in the summer, but it actually might be a slightly different mix of person who is coming to see New Zealand.
Yeah, I think though it is important to distinguish between air capacity and visitor numbers. It might be that we have 70% or so of the air capacity, and it's unknown whether they'll be completely filled with visitors or whether actually New Zealanders will be going out spreading their wings with slightly fewer visitors coming back. But even so, I think we might see a different type of visitor. There is potential there, and I don't think that would be a bad thing if the sort of visitor that's coming to New Zealand is someone that's really wanting to take their time to slowly and carefully, have an authentic experience through New Zealand. Because ultimately, when we look to the recovery of tourism, I'm not so much fixated on whether we recover to pre-COVID levels. I don't give a toss really whether we get to 100%. I'm more interested in, do we get value out of those visitors? So if these visitors are traveling for longer, if they're doing more things, if they're being more intentional about what they're doing and thinking about the impact that they're having on our communities, that wouldn't be a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about increasing sort of dollar earned per tourist rather than numbers of tourists coming through.
Yeah, exactly. So, I like to think about the value we get from visitors, a little bit more holistically than just the dollar. Part of it is if they can stay longer, we don't need to have as many people coming in to earn the same amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
But also if we can curate the experiences in a way that means that those people potentially have less impact or less burden on the communities that are welcoming them in. Because we do know that we confronted issues of social license pre-COVID, and that's something important for the sustainability of tourism from a social perspective. So that's something important. I also think that with tourism, we shouldn't be short-sighted in how we're getting value out of it. So part of it is mining someone's wallet while they're in New Zealand, and that's where the hotel, that's where the cafe, that's where the visitor operator benefits. But part of it is also how we connect up to that visitor and create a long-term enduring relationship with them and think about how that visit could leave a legacy on that person that influences some of their product choices and consumption patterns down the track. So how we can connect the visitor up with what New Zealand does that they could consume back when they're at home.
So the hope there is that they love their time in New Zealand, so they choose to buy New Zealand wine or New Zealand lamb, that type of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Why not? I mean, travel gives us a lot of memories, and part of that travel experience can be, getting to revisit those memories, when you're back home. It's funny, just to bring a personal anecdote. I know, one of the wines that we had at our wedding, was an Argentine vineyard we'd visited in Mendoza, and we had that at our wedding, and that was a good example of where travel for Argentina wasn't about mining our wallet while we were there. It was actually that long-term shift that had in our consumption. And to this day, quite frequently, a bottle of Argentine Malbec enters our supermarket trolley, all because of travel.
Right, sort of paying dividends after the fact. That's a really interesting way to look at tourism, because I sort of do think of it as just get them here and bleed their wallet as much as you can and then send them away. But you're sort of talking about building a much more lasting relationship as being something more beneficial for the country as a whole.
Yeah, it's about that lifetime value of the visitor. And rather than, I think often in tourism, we've thought about that lifetime value could be enhanced through repeat visitation. That's cool, of course, that's one way to get some more money. But the holy grail is, what if we can, get a kind of a perpetual stream of income out of that person without having to necessarily transport them across the globe every time? Because, the elephant in the room is that, for tourism, is that it is quite a big carbon emitter. So are there ways that we can extract even more value from our visitor without necessarily having to spew carbon?
Yeah. Let's talk about some of those structural trends in tourism, because it seems to me like while there is a whole bunch of pent up demand from the past few years, people are really keen to get out and see the world, see their family. There are some things that are probably pushing against it. One of those being carbon and the sort of, I guess, the stigma against traveling even sometimes that is beginning to crop up sometimes. But the other one is just inflation, and sort of recession risk. People are all around the world looking to cut their discretionary spending. Probably an overseas trip is the ultimate example of discretionary spending. How long do you think this sort of comeback, this recovery will last before some of these challenges start to bite back into it?
Look, I think some of these recessionary challenges might even have an impact on our summer season. They're not
Okay.
affecting things yet with winter, because it's that new shiny thing. There's so much pent up demand, and there's just not the capacity, both in flights and accommodation and everything, to get people in for winter. But come summer, I do believe that these recessionary and inflationary concerns could begin to cause some problems with the recovery. I want to put these in perspective. We're still going to have a recovery. It's just it limits how fast you can recover and how much you can charge your visitors. When we look at charging visitors for their experience, we're seeing a lot of operators. They've got a lot of cost pressures at present. It's not just the food that goes to the cafe, the electricity they have to spend money on. It's the diesel that goes into their tour bus, and in places like Queenstown, these extreme labour market challenges causing high rates of wage inflation. Now that's pushing up the cost side of things, and when visitors are a little bit more concerned about how their dollar is stretching, it's harder to push that on to the price that you charge. So I think there is going to be a pressure on margins for summer operators this summer, and more than we had originally anticipated. I guess we'd originally been thinking this is just a volume game. People will come back, will make money. But now we're in a situation where our costs are going up a lot. Visitors are a little bit worried about stretching their dollar. So we're going to have to be careful about how much we're charging.
So when you're talking about margins there, you're saying that tourism operators are under pressure. They're going to make a little bit less profit on each person just to get enough
exactly.
sales.
Yeah, definitely, because their costs are something they can't hide from, but ultimately they're selling a discretionary product, and that discretionary product, people they might be sensitive to price in certain segments of the market.
And we talked about the labor shortage. Is that extra cost people are having to pay to lure people out of industries they've swapped to, such as construction, to come back into tourism? Is that the biggest cost increase they're facing?
It's going to depend on the business, because for some businesses, fuel is just astronomical. Particularly the price of diesel and how much they're using. But yeah, labour is also a really big component of the tourism sector. It's a very labour-intensive industry, and we're seeing nationally that wages are going up 4 or 5%, and depending on different surveys you look at, it might even be 6 or 7%. But when you look in a market like Queenstown and you look at payroll statistics, we're seeing double-digit wage increases, 10 to 15%. And it's quite remarkable what businesses are having to pay for certain staff. There's even been media reports that some accommodation providers are talking that $30 might be the minimum wage that they're paying anyone to work in their establishment. And that is a reflection of just how tight the labour market is. There's not these people that are just sitting around waiting for a job. You're having to lure them into it. And there has been, tourism has in the past had a poor stigma, being low paid and challenging working conditions. So the sector's having to overcome those reputational issues as well to get people back into it.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like some of these things are forcing quite a significant change in the way that tourism businesses operate, and maybe some of it for the better. Do you think this is a chance to do the great tourism reset that we've talked about so many times?
Yeah, I think it can force some of that resetting. We did a lot of good planning during the pandemic, but it's really all about the implementation now. And if everything came back to us really fast and really easy, I think we would revert back to our old ways. There'd be very little of that destination management work that would actually be reflected on the ground. So these labour market shortages, in some ways, it is a bit of healthy tension. It's going to cause tourism operators long term to really think about what their workers are valuing. Some of that's money, but also some of it is in working conditions and how you can make sure that they have a good experience. The other part of it is going to be, we're going to need to get used to these things. Labour is short across the globe. It's not just a New Zealand problem. It's not just a tourism problem. It's everywhere. And so we're going to have to think about how we can deliver quality experiences efficiently with a lean workforce. Some of that will be about the systems and processes we use, about how we share labour between businesses and across seasons. But there's also going to be the need to invest in technological solutions where possible, to improve efficiencies, to operate with less people.
Yeah. It seems like an interesting time. There's going to be a lot of changes. One thing we talked about earlier was this news which came out recently that AirAsia is relaunching into New Zealand. What sort of signals is that giving you about where tourism is going and who's going to be coming into the country?
Yeah, well, the AirAsia move is quite an interesting one because we've been talking a lot about airfares going up. They've been going up for good reason. Jet fuel has gone through the roof. Wages going up a lot. The airlines have faced huge increases in demand and they didn't have much competition. So they were putting up their prices to protect their margin. Now we've had AirAsia come in, massively slash the cost of flying across the Tasman and onwards into Southeast Asia. So really what it's going to do is it's going to limit that upside potential to pricing for Air New Zealand and Qantas in particular on the Trans-Tasman market. So that's going to be one key thing. Now the volumes of people they're flying, they're not huge. It's just a few days a week at present, but it's still going to be a meaningful number of people, and it's into the Southeast Asian market, which is really good. They're they're an important market for us. They're really helpful at filling up our shoulder season. And AirAsia is coming in ahead of the summer, and they're coming in late spring. So it's really good to be able to get capacity that's at a really good price point into those markets, into people that might be a little bit price sensitive.
Mm-hmm. But for Air New Zealand and for Qantas, this is also going to mean pressure on margins, a little bit less freedom to price their product however they want to.
Yeah, they're just going to have to be a bit more careful with some of their pricing. They're no longer in essentially what's almost like become a de facto sort of duopoly over recent months. It's just a shot across the bows and saying, hey, competition will return, and it's not a next year thing. It's already going to start to happen.
Yeah. And I guess the flip side of that is they're flying out as well. Does that mean more New Zealanders will get cheap outgoing flights?
Oh yes, most certainly. So I mean, that's the thing. Competition. It's not only about the visitor. It's also about New Zealanders and their ability to reconnect with friends and family. And pre-COVID, we used to welcome, just under 4 million visitors a year to New Zealand. And it was, New Zealand travellers were not too far behind that.
Yeah. Okay. We're probably going to cut to questions pretty soon. So if our listeners have some questions, they should fire them in. But before we do, I was interested to hear your sort of view of what the best case scenario for the summer tourism season and beyond. Then we've sort of talked about the labour problems. How likely do you think that will be fixed? How close to the perfect summer are we going to get?
Look, for me, for the labour challenges over summer, I do hold out some hope that we're going to get the backpackers back. It's not going to be in the same manner as pre-COVID, but the reality is we haven't had the reinforcements come in yet from overseas. If you think about it, if you're coming to New Zealand on a working holiday, you don't wake up one morning and be like, I'm just going to quit my job and in 2 weeks' time fly to New Zealand. It takes quite a few months of planning. It might be that you're waiting to finish school, you're finishing university, you're trying to save up enough money to travel for a couple of months before you start work. So I do hold out hope that we'll get some of these working holiday makers come to New Zealand over summer, and they're they play a really important role because they help us overcome those periods of hyper demand, those real crux points during the summer season. And they're also the sort of people that'll go work in Timbuktu. They'll go work in the small town that it's actually hard to entice a New Zealander to be there for a couple of month job. So they'll play an important role.
Okay. Yeah, the backpacker labour force. I hadn't been thinking about that. All right. Well, let's cut across to some questions. Our first question is indeed about backpackers. They say, what level of tourist do you expect? Backpackers, fits, or tours? I don't actually know what a fit is. Can you explain that for us?
I believe off the top of my head, it's like free and independent tourists or visitors, or it's the acronyms along those lines. That's a really interesting one. Ultimately, I don't have a really good signal yet on what we're going to see in that space. Clearly, the Australian market that's been coming over, most of them fall into that space. But when the North Americans return, it's going to be interesting to see, how they fit into that spectrum. Ultimately, if we're looking at a way of enhancing the value that we're getting and curating the tourism experience differently, fits are going to play an important role in that space. But also, so is going to be working with our inbound operators that have tours and what they're doing and what demand signals that they're seeing, because one of the important, it's very difficult to understand demand signals from independents until they get to New Zealand and we can observe their behaviour. But tour operators, they're the ones that are getting the bookings. They're the ones that understand their channels already. So they can be an important early barometer for what's going to happen over the summer season.
Do you off the top of your head, sorry to put you on the spot, do you off the top of your head have some idea of the stats of breakdown of sort of both regionally, where did people come from, and then when they're here, what sort of categories they did, tours, independent? Do you have a stat on how that breaks down?
Look, I don't have a really good stat in front of me of exactly what they come for, whether it's business, visiting friends and family, whether it's part of a tour or as an independent. But I can tell you a little bit about where people came from pre-COVID. So if we look at up to March 20, the whole year up to basically when COVID first hit, we had about 3.6 million visitors to New Zealand. About 1.5 million of them were from Australia. Next biggest market were the US. They were about 350,000. About another 70,000 Canadians. So North America was well over 10%. The Chinese, they were at about 330,000. So they were looking at about 9%. And then we had, obviously a lot of people from the United Kingdom, and Germany as well, and other parts of Europe, as well as some other markets out of Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, but also increasingly we've seen people coming out of Southeast Asia as well.
Thus the Air Asia flights.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's a question here from Vanessa who asks, have you seen an impact from disruptors like Airbnb on the hotel sector, particularly in tourist hotspots, and has COVID changed that at all?
Yeah, so somewhere like Queenstown, most certainly, Airbnb has given us much more capacity than we would have otherwise had. Huge amount of capacity on Airbnb. It's interesting though to point out though that since COVID, we've had a number of hotels that have opened here. So actually, our underlying commercial accommodation stock is much higher than it was pre-COVID. Because of the staffing challenges we've talked about quite a bit before, hotels aren't able to sell all of their rooms at present, is one thing. The other interesting thing with Airbnb is that it offers quite an interesting product as well to the visitor. And I've seen in Queenstown in particular, it's been very appealing to certain visitor types. Now in the winter, Australian families, they really like booking Airbnbs for their ski weeks. And some of that's because people like hotels, of course, and they're fantastic, and they're always going to play an important role. But the Airbnb, it offers that complete and independent experience for the visitor who's going up the ski field. You can park, your vehicle out front to go up the mountain. You can cook. You've got your laundry, all those sort of things. So I think it's important with Airbnb to think about the role it's playing in the market, not just in terms of volume, but actually in terms of what it's offering, and realize it is a real part of our tourism ecosystem, and we shouldn't only focus on those commercial providers. The mums and dads and also commercial owners of properties that put it on Airbnb, they're an important part of the accommodation landscape.
I must admit, I love Airbnb. I don't necessarily like staying in hotels particularly much, but I love it when you have your own little house and you get to pretend you live there for a few days. I find that super enjoyable.
Yeah, and look, I guess one thing that I would want to point out on that front is that, so that's from a servicing the visitor perspective. Great, hugely important role, and we should never underestimate it. But we do need to think about some of the social challenges of it. And in a town like Queenstown with high accommodation costs, it did cause problems with the returns people were chasing on Airbnb, having many people pulling their houses out of the rental pool, and that was it was making some big problems in terms of workers being able to actually find affordable accommodation. And people were able to solve that. They would just bunk up a little bit more. So it works fine for the backpacker market. Instead of, one to a room, it's two, and maybe three's the new normal.
Oh, wow.
But how do you invite a family, to live long term? So that's one of the challenges. A family doesn't want to bunk up with multiple families.
Yeah. So if Airbnb is pushing up rental prices, that's actually making the labor shortage worse.
Yeah, well, it has the potential, or at least the types of workers that you can access. And when we try and think about ways of creating more year-round opportunities in tourism, that matters if you're trying to move away from something that's hyper seasonal.
Yeah. Here's a question that's similarly related. How would you see small regional motels needing to adapt to the changing visitor mix? How would they generate the longer term relationships and value that you talked about earlier, that small regional motels?
So quite honestly, and this is going to sound quite damning, but I think there really needs to be a focus on quality of what's happening. There's some fantastic, absolutely fantastic motels about the place. But as part of my job, I travel a lot to small parts of New Zealand. And this is probably going to sound quite contentious, but I'm quite often quite confronted by the oddities of small motels in New Zealand that are not necessarily, haven't been refurbished in a while and haven't adapted their service offering. It's things like when you turn up somewhere, and there's no plunger coffee, even, those types of little wraparounds, or, you've got really rationed internet and all those sorts of things. I think people really need to think about the product they're offering and look across at Airbnbs and what individuals are doing in that space. All those little bells and whistles and nice things around the edges. You've really got to focus on not what you've historically been offering the visitor, but what people are demanding and where people are moving with their wallets.
So a few more bells and whistles, some plunger coffee, unlimited Wi-Fi.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And not an espresso. Not an espresso.
Not an
because
espresso.
No, definitely not that. Something that's not throwing it out a little coffee pod just because I want a Caffeine Hut. So it's thinking about what you're doing, not providing it for the sake of it, and not just for efficiency reasons, but also tailored to what people, where taste and preferences are heading.
Yeah. And sounds like trying to reinforce that New Zealand clean, green, sustainable brand that we try and push, baking it into even the small details.
Yeah, exactly. And then also focusing on those softer things, like moteliers that have the time to chat to you and are really passionate about their local area and what you can do. That can also be worth its weight in gold. So it's not only about, what you provide within the unit itself, but it's the overall experience, to your visitor, and how enthused you are about, coming and seeing your part of the world.
Here's a question from Georgia. She asks, with a tight labour market in travel and tourism and high living expenses, do you think this will have a big impact on how many people choose to study travel or tourism? Will students choose to study an industry that's making more money and something they're less passionate about? But I think the question is trying to get at, are the amount of people studying tourism in New Zealand, wanting to go into the tourism industry, do you think that number has changed or shifted or is being affected in any way?
Look, I think we've been through a really weird period of time for wanting to study tourism. So on one hand, while there's been a lot of opportunities and there's been a lot of support for people wanting to go into training and vocational training into professions that might be helpful for the visitor sector, for example, hospitality and chefing, it's been very difficult to commit while there's been a lot of uncertainty. So I think we've now got to look ahead, knowing that the borders are back open. There does seem to be that demand. We've got to really think about how do we sustainably, over the long term, encourage people to come into the industry. And that's not only about, I said earlier about what they're paid, it's thinking about what the overall benefits look like in the industry and what the working conditions are like. And I think the sector has to be realistic. Pre-COVID, there was a lot of talk of tourism as a fantastic career. The reality is maybe tourism isn't a career for most. Maybe instead of it being a summer or two or a year or two, maybe it's a 5-year kind of apprenticeship in skills that they can reuse in other industries in life. Tourism teaches people some incredible soft skills, empathy, customer relations, business development, problem solving. So maybe the sector also needs to think about how they can, not long term, but just lengthening the duration that you retain workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really interesting because there are a lot of soft skills in there. One thing we discussed earlier was that idea of trying to make our guests long-term New Zealand buyers overseas. We talked about that in terms of motels. Do you have any examples of businesses who are doing a really good job of winning that sort of long-term relationship with incoming tourists?
Yeah, look, I think one of the best examples, I talked about it earlier, is actually in the wine industry. For a long period of time, they've realised the power of the visitor. And it's not what they make at their cellar door. I've always thought it's pretty stupid when someone's trying to charge you $5 for the wine tasting. That's short-sighted. It's really about getting that person enthused about what comes from your terroir, and getting them connected into your wine club long term. Or if you're a big enough brand and there's a distribution in their market, following them home, making sure they know how to get their hands on your product when you get back home. I think there's some lessons that can be learned in other industries, in the protein space, in the meat sector. A lot of visitors, they come to New Zealand, they want to visit a farm. Huge proportions will go and have a outdoor sort of farmyard type experience. Can we not have mashups between those sort of operators and the beef and lamb, and those that distribute and sell our meat products into the rest of the world? The horticulture and fruit sector, also jumps out. So I guess if there's a way we can curate a visitor experience that more intentionally connects people up to our food provenance and builds that food provenance value offering. Now, of course, there's also other ways that we can connect up long term, but it's harder to convert that person and actually influence their behaviour. So it might be there's opportunities in international education. If someone's come with their family, to raise awareness with their kids that they could potentially study, migration, investment opportunities into New Zealand. There are, many different avenues that we could explore.
Mm-hmm. I know the winemaker Akarua, which I think is right next to you in Queenstown. I went there and they gave me a tasting once, and they took very good care of me. And consequently, I've several times brought their bottles of wine from the supermarket. So it really does work. They've lured me into being a repeat customer, despite the fact that I haven't headed back to their cellar door in a long time.
Fantastic.
Here's a question that's not about tourism, but it is about travel. Talking about business tickets on airlines. They've doubled, apparently become much more expensive. Why and how important is business travel to airlines versus tourism? Particularly thinking about Air New Zealand here. Do they need tourists, or how does that kind of tourist versus business mix go?
Yeah, I think the massive increase in the cost of business tickets is just that whole demand supply type dynamic. There's been fewer planes flying. There's relatively few seats at the pointy end of the plane, and people with a lot of money, they're the ones that are wanting to fly, and those are the people less affected by inflation and recessionary concerns. So I think that's the thing to point out there. In terms of sorry, what was the second part of your question again?
Oh, more just like how important is business travel versus tourist travel to an airline? Which one? Yeah, are they of similar importance, or is one much more important than the other?
Yeah, look, it can vary depending on the market and the airline, but there is a lot of optimism that the future for travel will involve a lot more premium seats being sold. If you just look at, for example, what Qantas is doing in their ultra long haul bets, flying straight into North America and into Europe from the eastern seaboard of Australia. Those flight routes are being they're being made work because they're expecting to sell enough premium seats, and we're also seeing first class and that returning to many airlines. So I think increasingly airlines are seeing that as a potential avenue for growth for them. If not as many people are potentially flying around as frequently, perhaps they're better to just chase the pointy end.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're probably coming up against our allotted time. Here's one more question that we can probably sneak in. Will cruising, cruise ships, will they have an impact on longer stay tourism? What's the outlook for cruise ships?
Yeah, interesting. Look, if you look at bookings for the summer season, we've got about 80% of cruise capacity booked done. Who knows whether those cruise ships are going to be full up or not yet. I haven't seen any indications of how bookings have gone.
Yeah. All right. So the ships are coming back, hopefully with passengers on them, but we'll find out. Benji, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. Really, really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to everyone else for tuning in. It's great to have you. Next week on Shared Lunch, we're going to be talking to Michael Boggs, the CEO of NZME, which if you follow the stream far enough upstream, eventually becomes my boss. So that'll be interesting. A link to register for that discussion is in the chat right now. But until then, enjoy the rest of your week and stay safe.